change to English now. I'm going to speak a little bit slowly for the interpreters. I just want to thank also Red Mocaf for their engagement with the United Nations so far. Last year we had Gustavo speaking at our workshop, and he gave a very valuable and interesting input there, which has really progressed things a lot. So thank you very much to Red Mocaf for that engagement. I can start in the meantime. So just to say that the platform, which we call in English the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, was established in Paris at our COP, at COP21. So that was a huge moment in our process, a huge moment for Indigenous peoples and for local communities both. So the Paris Agreement recognized the role of local communities in that decision alongside Indigenous peoples, and their role together is to build a climate resilient future together with the governments. Detrás, one back. Slide 2, please. Okay. So the platform was basically established for the objective of accomplishing 3 different things, which you can see here. And this relates back to Omara's first question: what is the main objective of the platform? So you can see here the main objective is, first of all, to share knowledge. It is also to build capacity for engagement, right? So it's not capacity on anything. It's very specific. It's capacity to engage in the UNFCCC process, to have a voice at the table, and it's also to build the capacity of governments to work with local communities and Indigenous peoples. And I think this two-way capacity is really important. So it's not the usual kind of capacity building that we talk about in our process. Then the third function, which you can see at the top, this is climate change policies and actions. So getting local community voices into the policies and the decision-making that's being taken place at the national and at the international level. So I think the objectives of the platform are very clear, but how do we go about doing this? There is a work plan in place right now. It has 12 different activities, and all of these activities are based on these 3 functions, or these 3 objectives. All right, I'm just reading the chat. All right, so what we have at the moment are these 12 activities based on these 3 objectives, and there's a lot of space there for local communities and networks such as this network to get involved in those activities as we're doing them. So that's one way that we can enhance engagement with local communities. Governments, right, what we call parties under the UN process, governments have also been invited by the highest level body that we have to promote the participation and engagement of local communities. So this is already there. This has been established, and now it has to be enacted. Okay, so here we have a workshop that we held last year, which I mentioned before. This is the workshop which Gustavo presented at. Okay, there we go. So this workshop was on the topic of enhancing the participation of local communities in addition to Indigenous peoples in the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. The reason that this workshop was held was very specific. It was held because Indigenous peoples have a seat already in the working group, whereas local communities... Yeah, we can stop on this slide. Huh? So local communities still don't have a seat in the working group, and that's why this workshop was held. So look at how can local communities be more engaged in the participation. So this workshop brought together the ideas and experiences of experts across a range of UN and civil society organizations. And it also brought in a lot of voices from local communities as well as Indigenous peoples groups. It informed a wider deliberation on enhancing the participation of local communities. So it's part of something bigger. And this deliberation, this discussion on how to enhance local community participation will culminate next year. Next year is a very important year for us when the platform and the body called the Facilitative Working Group gets reviewed. And that's going to happen depending when we're able to have a session towards the middle of next year, hopefully, and at COP26, which will be taking place at the end of next year, hopefully. In that review, I'll discuss this more in depth, but governments are going to be deciding how and whether local communities can have a seat in one of the bodies of the UN. So in this workshop, a lot of topics were raised. A lot of topics were raised by Indigenous peoples, by local community representatives, and by governments. And we as the Secretariat pulled out some of the main topics that were discussed there. There were also others, but these were sort of some of the main highlights for us. First of all, self-mobilization and self-identification. Now, your network, you've already made huge steps in this regard. In other regions, it might be less so. But in Latin America, there's definitely one of the regions with the most progress in this regard. So self-mobilization and self-identification, it was noted in the workshop that the self-identification of local communities is an essential prerequisite to ensure participation, particularly in national decision-making, but also in the UN process. Secondly, you can see the second bullet, there are opportunities but also challenges that are presented by legal and policy frameworks and definitions of local communities, or a lack of definitions. Some of these, so we have lessons learned from Indigenous peoples groups, for instance. And for them, often the legal and policy frameworks help them. Some countries like Canada, Sweden, Finland include Indigenous peoples in constitutions, or they have their own parliaments. They have rights recognized at the national level, whereas for local communities in many countries and in many regions, this is more difficult. But there has been progress, mainly due to the fights of local communities. So the voice of local communities is getting stronger and stronger, specifically at the national level. Okay, I was actually waiting for the translation to finish. So if I stop, it's just because I'm waiting for the translation. So frameworks and legal policies can be a challenge, but they can also be an opportunity. This was something mentioned in the workshop. Another thing is that knowledge sharing can really facilitate transformative action. You can stay on the previous slide where we were. A key outcome of the workshop was an emphasis on the significant repository of local knowledge, right? And this local knowledge can contribute to environmental decision-making. So participants at that workshop noted the importance of understanding, respect, transmission, and safeguarding. That's really important, safeguarding traditional knowledge and local knowledge systems. And I think for me, the most important thing there is that if we're going to use local and traditional knowledge, it needs to be respected and understood. So further dialogues like these are really important. So a common recommendation that came out of the workshop was the need for more dialogues between local communities, such as this conference here, but also across regions, so more at the global level as well. All right, so having a look at this slide that's showing now, this is a picture of the Facilitative Working Group. The Facilitative Working Group is a constituted body under the United Nations, and it's the first body under the United Nations system where governments have equal leadership with non-government members of, in this case, Indigenous peoples representatives. So our Facilitative Working Group right now is made up of 14 members. 7 represent governments and 7 represent Indigenous peoples regions. Is that in the review taking place? So just pop over to the next slide. In the review that's taking place next year, governments are going to be deciding how and whether to add 3 additional members to this group from local communities. Okay, so what I'm talking about now are the next steps, how to better get engaged in the platform, how to make sure that you get a seat at the table. All right, so they will consider just go back one slide. They'll consider adding these 3 new seats to the body and potentially a few extra seats for governments as well, just to make a balance there. But what first needs to happen is that local communities under the UNFCCC process, so not at the regional level, but at the global level, local communities need to get in touch with the UNFCCC and fulfill a list of prerequisites, which I think Gustavo has. I can also send it to the group. It's basically, if you want to form an informal group, right, what we call a constituency under our process, you need to have a certain amount of things. So you need to be able to define who's in the group. You need to have nominated focal points. The group needs to be international, so it can't just be from one region, but it has to show that different regions are working together. And there's a few other prerequisites. If local communities can mobilize and get that informal constituency recognized under the UNFCCC, then it would convince parties, or it would help them in their consideration of putting new members into the facilitative working group from local communities, because they would be able